Welcome to day 139 of 66 and 26. For the second time this week, we're finishing off another book of the Bible. So this makes 14 books that we'll have completed if you are on track reading through all 66 books of the Bible in 2026 with us. We're in the book of Ephesians, finishing off the last three chapters of Paul's letter to the church of Ephesus. There are a couple things I want to highlight today. First is in Ephesians chapter 5, there's a place where Paul is addressing husbands and wives. And, quick story, I once had a premarital counseling session where I was working with a couple, and the young lady who was about to get married crossed her arms as we were looking at these verses in Ephesians chapter 5, and she says, "Now, why do I have to submit and all my husband has to do is love?" And I helped her to understand a little bit better that when Paul is talking about submission, he's actually saying this is a mutual thing. So if you read only verses 22, 23, and 24, you might get the impression that it's only the wife who has to obey everything her husband says. But actually, the verse before that, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, says, "Submit to one another." That's not just husbands and wives, that's any relationship that we're in. So actually, parents are submitting to their children, and husbands to their wives, and wives to their husbands, and children to their parents, and coworkers to coworkers, neighbors to neighbors. Whatever relationship we're in, we're actually called to put ourselves below another person and elevate them as more important than ourselves. That's God's design for our human relationships, even though we get this upside down in the world. And so it's not just wives submitting, it's also husbands. And it's something that is a mutual respect. And then husbands and wives also husbands love your wives. And it doesn't just say husbands love your wives, period. It says husbands love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So we die to ourselves and we live for someone else. That's exactly what Jesus did. The other thing I want to point out is in Ephesians chapter 6, where Paul addresses slaves and masters. And we might think as Christians, especially in our American context, with our very unfortunate, disastrous, and disturbing history of slavery, where people were taken out of Africa and dragged in chains to America in forced labor. And we think that is the Bible actually condoning slavery? Well, we have to understand that when the Bible talks about slavery, it's very often talking about indebted slavery. So someone who had a debt to somebody and was enslaved because of that debt, not because of forced servitude. Although that did happen in the ancient world as well. What Paul is talking about is if you are in this position where you have someone who is a master over you, then you should submit yourself to that person and obey in reverence to the Lord. And master, same thing. You should actually treat those who are indebted to you with respect and honor as someone who is a brother or sister in Christ. And so in all of our relationships, what Paul is really pushing here is that we would have the attitude that is that same attitude of Christ. We'll see this next week in the book of Philippians, chapter 2, where Paul says we should have the same mind that was in Christ, and that is, even though he was God himself, he put himself below humankind and made himself a servant to humans, even though he had no business having to do that. He did that because that's the very nature of God, to put himself below for the sake of other. And that's what we're called to do too. In modeling our lives after Jesus, we put others ahead of ourselves and we submit ourselves to them in love and respect and reverence for Christ.